Welcome to the channel Liturgy of Slaves. On August 17th, 1885, outside Yazoo City, Mississippi, a man named Solomon Turner died on his knees in a cotton field. He was 73 years old. When they found him, his hands were still bleeding. The overseer said he'd collapsed from the heat, but the other workers knew better. That morning, they'd seen the marks on his back, fresh ones laid over scars, so old they'd turned white as chalk. Solomon had told the overseer he couldn't work that day. His chest hurt. His breathing came short and rough like broken glass. The overseer's answer had been a whip and a command: get to the field or get nothing. 20 years after the war ended, 20 years after Lincoln signed that paper, Solomon Turner died picking cotton for a man named Dalton Marsh. And he wasn't the first. The story of what happened on the Marsh farm that summer would later be buried in courthouse records that almost nobody read. But the people who lived it, who survived it, they carried those memories like stones in their pockets. Heavy, sharp, impossible to forget, because what Dalton Marsh did wasn't just cruelty. It was a system, a choice, a deliberate grinding down of human beings who'd already given everything and had nothing left to give except their last breaths. And when those breaths finally stopped, Marsh would simply shrug and say the work had to get done. That's how it was. That's how it had always been. Before we continue this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. Stories like this must never be forgotten. Let's continue. The year 1885 sat strange in the American South. The war had ended 2 decades earlier. Slavery was illegal. The 13th Amendment said so. But laws on paper and life in the dirt were 2 different things entirely. In the Mississippi Delta, where the soil was black and rich and the cotton grew thick as clouds, old systems died hard. They just changed their names. What had been slavery became sharecropping. What had been ownership became debt. And for people like Solomon Turner, freedom was just another word that white men could redefine whenever it suited them. Dalton Marsh owned 400 acres just west of Yazoo City in Yazoo County, where the Yazoo River curved through bottomland so fertile you could grow anything if you didn't mind the floods. His family had owned that land since before Mississippi was even a state. His grandfather had built the main house in 1831. His father had expanded the fields and bought more people to work them. And when the Confederacy fell and those people were supposed to be free, the Marsh family simply waited. They knew hunger would bring them back, and it did. By 1885, Dalton Marsh employed 43 workers on his land. He called them sharecroppers, but the arrangement was closer to bondage. They lived in cabins Marsh owned. They bought food from a store Marsh ran. They owed him for seed, for tools, for the very dirt they worked. At the end of each season, after the cotton was weighed and sold, Marsh would sit down with his ledger and show them the numbers. "You owe me more than you earned," he'd say. "Try again next year." And so they did, because where else could they go? Solomon Turner had been on that land for 56 years. He'd been born there in 1812, before Mississippi was 10 years old, back when the Choctaw still lived in the northern hills, and the land was being carved into plantations by men who wanted to be kings. Solomon's mother had been brought from Virginia in chains. His father he never knew. As a child, Solomon had picked cotton beside his mother until she died of fever when he was 9. After that, he just kept picking through his teens, through his 20s, through the war when the white men left to fight, and the overseers got meaner because there was nobody watching. And then through the years after, when freedom came but didn't change much. By 1885, Solomon was old. His back was bent from decades of stooping. His hands were gnarled like tree roots. His vision had gone soft around the edges, but he still worked because Dalton Marsh told him the debt wasn't paid, and because stopping meant starving. There were others like him on the Marsh farm, elderly men and women who'd been enslaved as children and never really escaped. People like Celia Brooks, who was 68 and had arthritis so bad her fingers wouldn't straighten. Like Moses Grant, 71, who coughed blood every morning but still dragged himself to the fields because Marsh said, "If you don't work, you don't eat." These were people who'd survived the worst of slavery, who'd lived to see the war end and Lincoln's promise made, and who now found themselves trapped in a new kind of hell that looked almost same as the old one. Dalton Marsh was 42 years old in 1885. He had a wife named Caroline and 3 children. He went to church every Sunday at the Yazoo City Baptist Church on Main Street, where he sat in the 3rd pew and sang hymns in a decent baritone. People in town respected him. He was a landowner, a businessman, a man who paid his bills and kept his word with other white men. What he did on his own property with his own workers was his concern. That's what people said, that's what they believed. But Marsh had a cruelty in him that went beyond economics. It wasn't just about profit. It was about power, about control, about making sure these people, these former slaves who'd been freed by law but not by circumstance, understood that he still owned them in every way that mattered. And when they got old, when their bodies broke down and they couldn't work as hard, Marsh didn't let them rest. He punished them, he called it discipline, he called it necessity, but what it really was violence. The summer of 1885 was brutal. The heat came early and stayed late. By mid-July, the temperature in Yazoo County was hitting 95 degrees by noon and not dropping below 80 even at night. The air was thick and wet, hard to breathe, like drowning in warm water. In the cotton fields, the plants grew tall and healthy, their white balls bursting open right on schedule. It should have been a good season, but for the workers it was agony. Solomon Turner had been feeling sick since June. A tightness in his chest that wouldn't go away, a pain that spread down his left arm when he lifted anything heavy. He didn't tell anyone at first because complaining meant trouble, but by August he couldn't hide it anymore. His breathing came short and shallow. His face went gray. One morning he couldn't get out of bed. Celia Brooks found him that morning, August 16th. She lived in the cabin next to his, a one-room shack with gaps in the walls wide enough to see through. She'd heard him coughing all night, a deep, wet sound that scared her. When he didn't come out at dawn, she knocked on his door. Solomon was sitting on the edge of his cot, bent forward, holding his chest. "I can't do it today," he told her. His voice was barely a whisper. "I can't go out there." Celia had known Solomon her whole life. They'd worked side by side since they were children. She knew what this meant. "You got to tell Marsh," she said. "You got to let him know you're sick." Solomon shook his head. "He won't care." But there was no choice. At 6:00 in the morning, when the overseer came around to count heads, Solomon was missing. The overseer's name was Virgil Tate, a lean man with a sunburned face and a leather strap he wore on his belt like a badge. Tate had worked for the Marsh family since he was 16. He'd been an overseer during slavery, and he'd stayed an overseer after. The title was the same, so were his methods. Tate found Solomon in his cabin and dragged him outside. Solomon tried to explain, tried to say he was sick, that his heart wasn't right, that he needed rest. Tate didn't listen. He said Marsh didn't pay men to lie in bed. He said if Solomon could talk, he could work. And then he took that leather strap off his belt and he used it. The other workers heard it, the sound of the strap hitting flesh. Solomon's voice crying out once, then going silent. When Tate was done, he told Solomon to get to the field. Solomon went. He had no choice. He walked slow, his back bleeding through his shirt, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Celia walked beside him, holding his arm, trying to keep him upright. Neither of them spoke. The field that day was hell. The sun was merciless. The air shimmered with heat. Solomon worked as long as he could, moving down the rows, pulling balls from the plants, dropping them into his sack. His hands shook, his vision blurred. Around mid-morning, he stopped and sat down in the dirt. Celia saw him and ran over. Moses Grant came too. They tried to get him to drink water, but Solomon just shook his head. "I'm done," he said. They didn't know if he meant done for the day or done forever, but they helped him stand, and they kept him moving because stopping meant Tate would come back. And Tate did come back around noon, riding through the field on his horse, checking progress. He saw Solomon moving slow, saw him stumbling, and he rode over. "You ain't picked half what you should," Tate said. Solomon didn't answer. He couldn't. He was using all his strength just to breathe. Tate climbed down from his horse. He walked up to Solomon and shoved him, not hard, just enough to make him stagger. "I said you ain't picked enough." "He's sick," Celia said. She was standing a few feet away, still holding her own sack. "Can't you see he's sick?" Tate turned to her. "You want to take his place." Celia went quiet. Everyone did. You didn't argue with Tate. You didn't argue with any white man, but especially not one with a strap and the boss's permission to use it. Tate turned back to Solomon. "Get moving." Solomon tried. He really did. He took 2 steps, bent down to reach for another ball, and then his legs gave out. He fell forward, his face hitting the dirt, his body going limp. For a moment nobody moved. Then Celia screamed. Moses Grant was the one who ran to get help. But by the time he came back with 2 other men, Solomon Turner was already dead. His heart had finally quit right there in the field under the Mississippi sun, 73 years after he'd been born into slavery on that same piece of land. The men carried his body back to the cabins and laid him out on a wooden board. Someone went to tell Dalton Marsh. Marsh came down to the cabins that evening after supper, after the sun had gone down and the heat had finally broken a little. He stood in the doorway of Solomon's cabin and looked at the body. Celia and Moses and a few others were there, sitting quiet, not sure what to do. Marsh didn't say much. He asked how it happened. Tate told him Solomon had been lazy, that he'd refused to work, that he'd collapsed from stubbornness. Marsh nodded like that made sense. "Bury him tomorrow," Marsh said. "Make sure it's done early. Everyone else needs to be in the field by sunrise." That was it. No condolences, no acknowledgement of a man who'd spent his entire life working that land. Just an order to get rid of the body and get back to work. The funeral was held the next morning before dawn. There was no preacher, no ceremony, just a hole dug in the corner of the property where other workers had been buried over the years. Celia and Moses and a handful of others stood around the grave while 2 men lowered Solomon's body into the ground, wrapped in an old sheet. Nobody spoke. There were no words that felt right. When it was done, they covered the grave with dirt and went to the field. But something had changed. The death of Solomon Turner, quiet as it was, had broken something inside the people who'd known him. They'd lived through so much already: slavery, war, Reconstruction, the false promise of freedom, and now this. Watching an old man worked to death because he dared to say he was sick. It was too much. Moses Grant was the first to speak up. 3 days after Solomon's funeral, Moses told Virgil Tate he couldn't work. His cough had gotten worse. He was spitting up blood every morning, thick and dark. He needed rest. He needed a doctor. Tate's response was predictable. He told Moses the same thing he'd told Solomon: "If you can talk, you can work." But Moses didn't go to the field that day. He stayed in his cabin, and when Tate came to drag him out, Moses locked the door. It was a small act of defiance, but it was defiance nonetheless, and Dalton Marsh couldn't allow it. Marsh came to Moses's cabin himself that afternoon with Tate and 2 other men. They broke down the door. Moses was sitting on his cot, too weak to stand, his shirt stained with blood from coughing. Marsh looked at him with something close to disgust. "You think you're special," Marsh said. His voice was calm, almost conversational. "You think you get to decide when you work." Moses looked up at him. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken. "I'm dying," he said. Marsh shrugged. "Then die in the field." They dragged Moses outside and beat him in front of everyone. Tate used his strap. The other men used their fists. Moses tried to fight back at first, but he didn't have the strength. When they were done, they left him lying in the dirt and walked away. Celia and 2 other women ran over and carried Moses back to his cabin. He was barely conscious. His face was swollen. His ribs were broken. Moses Grant died 2 days later, August 22, 1885. He was 71 years old. This time people didn't stay quiet. The meeting happened on a Sunday night in the woods behind the cabins, far enough from the main house that Marsh and Tate wouldn't hear. 15 people came, men and women, young and old, all of them workers on the Marsh farm. Celia Brooks was there. So was a younger man named Daniel Perry, who was only 35, but had been working the land since he was a child. They sat in a circle on the ground, speaking in low voices, trying to figure out what to do. "We can't keep living like this," Daniel said. "They killed Solomon, they killed Moses, who's next? We leave," someone said. A woman named Ruth, 46 years old, who'd lost 2 children to fever because Marsh wouldn't let her take time off to care for them. "We just leave, walk away, and go where?" another man asked. His name was Isaac. He was 52 and had been trying to leave for years. "We got no money, no land. We walk away and we starve. We are starving here," Ruth shot back. Celia spoke up then, her voice quiet but firm. "We need help. We need someone outside this place to know what's happening." "Who's going to help us?" Isaac said. "The sheriff, the judge, they're all Marsh's friends." "There's people in Jackson," Daniel said, "government people. Reconstruction ain't over everywhere. There's still folks who care." It was a thin hope, but it was something. They decided Daniel would go. He'd walk to Yazoo City, try to catch a train or a wagon heading south to Jackson, and find someone, anyone who might listen. It was dangerous. If Marsh found out, Daniel would be punished, maybe killed. But staying was just as dangerous. Daniel left 2 nights later in the middle of the night, carrying nothing but a little food and a letter Celia had written describing what was happening on the Marsh farm. The letter was simple, written in careful handwriting on a scrap of paper. It listed names: Solomon Turner, Moses Grant, others who died over the years. It described the beatings, the starvation wages, the debts that never decreased. It asked for help. Daniel walked 15 miles to Yazoo City and caught a ride on a freight wagon heading south. It took him 3 days to reach Jackson. When he got there, he went to the Freedmen's Bureau office on Capitol Street, but the office was closed. The bureau had been officially shut down in 1872, though a few former agents still worked in the area. Daniel asked around and found a man named Samuel Proctor, a black lawyer who'd been born enslaved in Alabama and had taught himself to read during the war. Proctor had a small office above a tailor shop on Parish Street. Daniel climbed the stairs and knocked on the door. Proctor listened to Daniel's story. He read Celia's letter. He asked questions. How many workers were on the Marsh farm? How long had this been going on? Were there records, witnesses, proof? Daniel answered as best he could. When he was done, Proctor sat back in his chair and sighed. "You understand what you're asking me to do," Proctor said. "You're asking me to go up against a white landowner in Yazoo County, a man with money and connections, a man who can make my life very difficult." "I understand," Daniel said. "But if you don't help us, nobody will." Proctor was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "I'll see what I can do." It took Proctor 2 weeks to gather information and file a formal complaint with the district court in Yazoo City. He documented the deaths of Solomon Turner and Moses Grant. He interviewed other workers who'd managed to leave the Marsh farm over the years. He built a case. It wasn't perfect. The evidence was thin. Most of it was testimony from black workers, which many white judges wouldn't take seriously. But it was something. The complaint was filed on September 10, 1885. It accused Dalton Marsh of involuntary servitude, assault, and manslaughter. It asked for an investigation. It asked for justice. Marsh was furious when he found out. He immediately hired a lawyer, a man named Harrison Cobb, who'd been a Confederate officer during the war and now specialized in defending white landowners against what he called frivolous accusations. Cobb filed a motion to dismiss the case, arguing that the workers were not enslaved, that they were free to leave at any time, and that any debts they owed were legitimate business arrangements. He also argued that the deaths of Solomon Turner and Moses Grant were unfortunate but not criminal. Old men died, that was life. The hearing was set for October 15, 1885 at the Yazoo County Courthouse. The courthouse in Yazoo City sat on the corner of Main Street and Washington, a two-story brick building with white columns and a clock tower that hadn't worked in years. It had been built in 1872, right after the old courthouse burned down during what some people called the Troubles, and other people didn't talk about at all. On the morning of October 15, 1885, a crowd gathered outside. Most of them were white farmers, merchants, men who had business with the court or just wanted to see what would happen. A few black people stood at the edges, keeping quiet, trying not to draw attention. Inside, the courtroom was hot and close. The windows were open, but there was no breeze. Judge William Hackett sat at the bench, a heavy man with gray whiskers and a face that looked permanently annoyed. He'd been a judge since before the war, had kept his position through Reconstruction by being careful about which cases he heard and which ones he ignored. He was 71 years old and had no patience for what he considered outside interference. Samuel Proctor sat at one table with Daniel Perry beside him. Daniel had come back to testify, risking everything. At the other table sat Dalton Marsh and his lawyer, Harrison Cobb. Marsh wore a clean suit and looked calm, almost bored. Cobb had a stack of papers in front of him and a confidence that came from knowing the game was rigged in his favor. The gallery was full, white folks mostly, but in the back row sat Celia Brooks and 3 other workers from the Marsh farm who'd been allowed to come only because Proctor had insisted they were witnesses. They sat with their hands folded, not looking at Marsh, barely breathing. Judge Hackett banged his gavel and the room went quiet. "This court is now in session," Hackett said. "We're here regarding a complaint filed by Mr. Samuel Proctor on behalf of certain individuals against Mr. Dalton Marsh. Mr. Proctor, you may proceed." Proctor stood. He was a small man, thin and dark-skinned, wearing a suit that was clean but worn at the elbows. He cleared his throat and began. "Your Honor, I'm here to present evidence that Mr. Dalton Marsh has engaged in practices that violate the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution. Specifically, he has held workers on his property through debt peonage, has subjected them to physical punishment, and has caused the deaths of at least 2 individuals through negligence and cruelty." Cobb stood immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Proctor is making accusations without evidence. This is slander, plain and simple." "Sit down, Mr. Cobb," Hackett said, though his tone suggested he agreed. "Mr. Proctor will present his evidence and then you'll have your turn." Proctor nodded and called Daniel Perry to the stand. Daniel walked forward slowly, his hands shaking. He'd never been in a courtroom before, never spoken in front of white men who had the power to hurt him, but he took the oath and he sat down. And when Proctor asked him to describe conditions on the Marsh farm, Daniel did. He told the court about the cabins with no floors and holes in the roofs, about the store where Marsh charged twice what things cost in town, about the ledgers where the numbers never made sense, where a man could work all year and end up owing more than he started with. He described the beatings, the leather strap Virgil Tate carried, the way old people were forced to work even when they were sick, even when they were dying. "Tell the court about Solomon Turner," Proctor said. Daniel's voice got quieter. Solomon was an old man, 73. He'd been on that land his whole life. Last August he got sick. His heart was bad. He told the overseer he couldn't work. The overseer beat him and sent him to the field anyway. Solomon died that same day, right there in the dirt. And Moses Grant. Moses was 71. He had a cough, bad one. He was spitting blood. He asked for rest and they beat him too. He died 2 days later. The courtroom was silent. Proctor let the words hang there for a moment before he said, "Thank you, Mr. Perry." Cobb stood for cross-examination. He walked slowly toward Daniel, his hands behind his back, a slight smile on his face. "Mr. Perry," Cobb said, "you say you were a worker on Mr. Marsh's farm." "Yes, sir." "And you left without permission?" Daniel hesitated. "I left to get help, so you abandoned your obligations. You owed Mr. Marsh money, did you not?" "I worked for him for years. I don't owe him nothing." Cobb picked up a piece of paper from his table. "According to Mr. Marsh's records, you owed him $63 at the time you left." "That's theft, Mr. Perry." "That ain't theft," Daniel said. "That's his lies written in a book." There was a murmur in the gallery. Judge Hackett banged his gavel. "Watch your tongue, boy." Cobb smiled wider. "Mr. Perry, did anyone force you to stay on Mr. Marsh's farm? Were you chained, locked up?" "No, but—" "So you were free to leave at any time?" "Where was I supposed to go? I got no money, no land." "That's not Mr. Marsh's fault," Cobb said. "You made choices. You incurred debts. Mr. Marsh was kind enough to let you work them off, and you repaid him by running away and making false accusations." Proctor stood. "Objection, he's badgering the witness." "Overruled," Hackett said. Cobb continued. "Tell me, Mr. Perry, did you witness Mr. Marsh himself strike Solomon Turner or Moses Grant?" Daniel paused. "No, it was the overseer." "So you have no direct evidence that Mr. Marsh ordered any violence?" "He knew what was happening. He came and looked at Solomon's body and didn't care." "That's not what I asked. Did you here Mr. Marsh order anyone to be struck?" "No, thank you. No further questions." Daniel stepped down, looking defeated. Proctor called Celia Brooks next. She was terrified, but she came forward. She described the same conditions, the same cruelty. She'd known Solomon and Moses her whole life. She'd been there when they died. Her testimony was powerful, emotional, but Cobb tore into her the same way. He questioned her memory, her motives. He implied she was lying to avoid her own debts. By the time she stepped down, she was crying. Proctor called one more witness, a man named Thomas Wade, who'd worked for Marsh and left 3 years earlier. Wade described similar conditions, similar violence, but Cobb brought out records showing Wade had been arrested for theft in 1883 and argued his testimony was unreliable. When Proctor rested his case, Cobb called Dalton Marsh to the stand. Marsh walked forward with confidence. He took the oath and sat down, and when Cobb asked him to describe his relationship with his workers, Marsh spoke in a calm, reasonable voice that made him sound like a victim. "I've employed these people for years," Marsh said. "I've given them housing, food, supplies. I've treated them fairly. They work and I pay them. Some of them incur debts, yes, but that's their choice. I don't force anyone to buy from my store or stay on my land. They're free to leave whenever they want." "And the accusations of violence?" Cobb asked. "I run a farm, Mr. Cobb. It's hard work. Sometimes my overseer has to maintain discipline, but I've never ordered anyone beaten. I've never harmed anyone." "What about Solomon Turner and Moses Grant?" Marsh shook his head slowly as if saddened by the memory. "Those were tragic losses. Solomon was an old man. He'd been with my family since I was a boy. I cared for him, but he was old and sick. His heart gave out. As for Moses, he had consumption. He'd been coughing for months. I told him he should rest, but he insisted on working. He was a proud man. When he died, I paid for his burial myself." It was a lie, every word. But Marsh said it with such sincerity that people in the gallery nodded along. Proctor stood for cross-examination. "Mr. Marsh, you say your workers are free to leave, but they owe you money, don't they?" "Some do. And if they leave without paying, you can have them arrested. That's the law. So they're not really free, are they?" Cobb objected before Marsh could answer. "That's argumentative, Your Honor." Sustained. Proctor tried a different approach. "Mr. Marsh, how much did Solomon Turner owe you when he died?" Marsh thought for a moment. "I'd have to check my records. $30, maybe $40. "And how long had he worked for you?" "Most of his life, 50 years, something like that." 50 years of work, and he still owed you money." Marsh shrugged. He wasn't a young man. He couldn't work as much as he used to. The debt accumulated. Or you made sure it did. Cobb shot to his feet. "Objection, withdrawn." Proctor said. He knew he was losing. He could feel it in the room. The judge wasn't on his side. The jury, all white men, landowners and businessmen, wasn't on his side. This wasn't about evidence or truth. It was about power. Proctor sat down. Cobb rested his case. Judge Hackett called a recess for deliberation, but everyone knew it was just for show. 30 minutes later, the court reconvened. Judge Hackett read his decision without looking at anyone. "This court finds that Mr. Dalton Marsh has not violated any laws of the state of Mississippi or the United States. The workers on his farm entered into voluntary agreements and are free to leave at any time. The deaths of Solomon Turner and Moses Grant, while unfortunate, were the result of natural causes and old age, not negligence or cruelty. The complaint is dismissed. The gavel came down. The courtroom erupted in chatter. Marsh stood and shook Cobb's hand. Proctor sat still, staring at the table in front of him. In the back row, Celia Brooks covered her face with her hands. Outside, Daniel Perry stood on the courthouse steps and watched Dalton Marsh walk away, smiling, untouched, unpunished. The law had spoken, and it had said that what happened on that farm, the suffering and the dying, was perfectly legal. News of the trial spread quickly, not in newspapers. The Yazoo City Herald ran a small article saying the court had dismissed a frivolous complaint against a respected landowner. But word traveled through other channels, through churches and meeting halls, through the networks of black communities across Mississippi who'd seen this story play out 1,000 times in 1,000 different places. Some people left the Marsh farm after the trial. They packed what little they had and walked away, knowing they'd be starting from nothing but unable to stay. Daniel Perry was one of them. He went to Jackson and found work at a lumber mill. Celia Brooks stayed. She had nowhere else to go. She was 68 years old. She'd lived her entire life on that land, first as a slave, then as a worker who might as well have been a slave. She stayed because leaving meant dying somewhere unfamiliar, and at least here, she knew where the graves were. Dalton Marsh continued running his farm exactly as he had before. The trial hadn't touched him. If anything, it had emboldened him. He'd won. The law had said he was right, and so the work continued. The cotton was planted and picked. The debts were tallied. The cabins leaked when it rained, and when workers got too old or too sick to be useful, they were worked until they couldn't work anymore. In November of 1885, a woman named Alberta Mason died in her cabin. She was 64. She'd been running a fever for a week, but kept working because she knew what happened if she stopped. One morning, she didn't wake up. In January of 1886, a man named Joseph Turner, no relation to Solomon, collapsed in the field. He was 70. His body was buried the same day. No ceremony, no words, just dirt. The pattern continued year after year, not just on the Marsh farm, but on farms across the South. Different names, different places, but the same story. The 13th Amendment had ended slavery in name, but in practice, for thousands of people, freedom was still just a promise waiting to be kept. Samuel Proctor tried to bring other cases after the Marsh trial. He filed complaints against 3 more landowners in Mississippi. All of them were dismissed. By 1890, Proctor had given up and moved north to Illinois, where he opened a small practice and tried to forget what he'd seen in Mississippi. Daniel Perry worked at the lumber mill in Jackson for 8 years. In 1893, he saved enough money to buy a small piece of land in Hinds County. 5 acres, not much, but it was his. He built a house and grew vegetables and never worked for a white man again. He lived to be 76 and told his children and grandchildren about Solomon Turner and Moses Grant. He made sure they knew the names. Celia Brooks died in 1891, 6 years after the trial. She was 74. She died in the same cabin where she'd been born, on the same land where she'd spent her entire life. She was buried in the corner of the Marsh property, in the same ground as Solomon and Moses and all the others. No marker, no stone, just a place in the dirt that would eventually be plowed over and forgotten. Dalton Marsh lived until 1903. He died wealthy, respected, surrounded by family. His obituary in the Yazoo City Herald called him a pillar of the community, and a successful farmer who embodied the values of hard work and Southern tradition. It didn't mention Solomon Turner or Moses Grant or any of the others. Those names weren't part of the story people wanted to remember. The records of the trial were stored in the basement of the Yazoo County Courthouse. For decades, they sat in a wooden box, collecting dust. In 1969, during the Civil Rights Movement, a young historian named Margaret Doss was researching post-Civil War labor practices in Mississippi. She found the box and read through the testimonies. She was the first person in 84 years to look at those documents with any real attention. Das wrote an article about the Marsh case for a small academic journal. She described the conditions on the farm, the deaths, the trial, the dismissal. She argued that what happened to Solomon Turner and Moses Grant was not an isolated incident, but part of a systematic continuation of slavery under different names. Her article was read by a few dozen scholars and then mostly forgotten, but the story lived on in other ways. In family histories passed down through generations, in the memories of descendants who knew their great-grandparents had died on land they didn't own, working for men who didn't value their lives. In the understanding that freedom, real freedom, was something still being fought for. There's a place in Yazoo County where the Marsh farm used to be. The land was sold off in pieces after Dalton Marsh's son died without heirs in 1947. Some of it became part of a larger corporate farm. Some of it was left empty and overgrown. The main house burned down in 1958. The cabins where the workers lived rotted away and collapsed. The fields are still there, still growing cotton, still worked by people who don't own the land. If you walked that property today, you wouldn't find any markers. No graves with names, no historical plaques. Nothing to tell you that Solomon Turner died there with a whip mark on his back. Nothing to tell you that Moses Grant was beaten for being too sick to work. Nothing to tell you that dozens of people spent their entire lives in bondage there, even after slavery was supposed to be over. But the ground remembers. Soil holds memory in ways we don't always see, and somewhere in that black delta dirt in the land that was worked and watered with suffering, the story remains. Not in monuments or official records, but in the roots of things, in the knowledge that what was done there mattered. That the people who died there mattered, that their names, even if they were never carved in stone, deserved to be spoken. Solomon Turner, Moses Grant, Celia Brooks, Alberta Mason, Joseph Turner. And all the others whose names were never written down, whose graves were never marked, whose lives were never counted as valuable by the people with power. They lived, they suffered, they died, and their story is part of the foundation this country was built on. A foundation of labor that was never fairly paid, of lives that were never fairly valued, of a freedom that was promised but never fully delivered. That's the truth, that's what happened, and that's why we tell these stories, so the ground doesn't forget. So we don't forget. So the next generation knows what was done and what was lost and what is still owed. Remember their names. Thanks for watching, dear.